proud moment for us as Indigenous people across the country, across the land.
Some Indigenous groups celebrate a victory over the Trans Mountain Pipeline. A federal court struck down approval to build the expansion. Finance Minister Bill Morneau blames the decision on the previous Conservative government.
Our government inherited a flawed environmental review process, and we made efforts to improve it. We're going to review today's decision to ensure that we're meeting high standards when it comes to both protecting the environment and meeting our obligations to consult with Indigenous peoples.
The Federal Court of Appeal has dealt a blow to the federal government, siding with Indigenous and environmental groups who oppose the $7.4 billion expansion project. But despite the outcome, Finance Minister Bill Morneau says the investment makes economic sense for Canadians.
The courts asked us to respond promptly and in a meaningful way to today's decision and has given us some good directions on next steps. As a government, we take our responsibilities seriously. While we want to make sure that the project proceeds, we also want to make sure it moves ahead in the right way. Today, Kinder Morgan shareholders also voted to endorse our government's purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion and its related assets. Our next step is to close on the acquisition of the project, and we expect that will happen as early as tomorrow.
So a clear message from the Trudeau government pushing ahead with the project review. The CBC's JP Tasker is following the latest developments from Ottawa. So JP, let's break down the decision. What exactly did the court rule?
Yeah, Andrew, I can't emphasize enough just how much of a stunning development this really is. It is a nightmare scenario for the Liberal government as it now owns this pipeline. But let's walk through exactly what the Federal Court of Appeal said today. Justice Eleanor Dawson gave down her ruling today, and she really picked apart the government's approval of the project in two areas. And the first one, they said that the NEB, the National Energy Board, the energy regulator in this country, simply did not do enough on the environmental front, did not do its homework in actually crafting the assessment it produced when it gave Cabinet its decision to approve this project. And really what it took issue with, what the federal court took issue with today, was the NEB's decision not to review at all the marine considerations in all this, the sea, the impact that actually twinning and expanding this massive pipeline project could have on tanker traffic in the Burrard Inlet, in the lower mainland of British Columbia. That was not even remotely part of their environmental assessment process. So that was a problem for the court. On the second front, it said the federal cabinet, the federal government, did not do enough to ensure that its bodies, the federal government, the federal bodies that are in charge of doing this sort of thing, did not consult enough with Indigenous peoples. They didn't meaningfully consult with Indigenous peoples, did not get their perspective, or didn't necessarily do enough to see if they had been accommodated when this pipeline project was going through their traditional territory. Of course, they were worried about the impact on marine safety as well, because their communities are on the coast and they depend on the southern resident killer whale population that are in those waters. So essentially, the justice saying today there are a lot of problems here. You got to go back to the drawing board. Let's get some things done before this project actually moves ahead, if of course it moves ahead at all.
Yeah, because does this ruling spell perhaps the beginning of the end for this expansion project?
It's hard to say, Andrew, because we don't know how long this whole process is going to take. As I said, they have to go back to the drawing board. Will it be months? Will it be years worth of consultation that are required to satisfy the court and its ruling today? We don't actually have answers to those right now, though. Speaking to experts, they say it might be possible that the federal government could wrap up this new consultation process fairly quickly. They might be able to put a timeline on it for that it's done in a matter of months. That's hopeful. That's a hopeful outlook for how this whole thing will unfold. Of course, the federal government has a lot riding on this project. They spent a lot of political capital trying to get it built. They're also the owner of the pipeline now. They spent $4.5 billion, so they're going to want to see this pipeline project through, or else we're on the hook for quite a bit of money, and we don't really know if that's something they're willing to do, if they're willing to step away from this project now because of all the money they've invested in the project.
Yeah, I mean, so far the finance minister is saying no, we are buying this and we're going to buy this as soon as tomorrow. What kind of reaction are we seeing so far?
Yeah, we're hearing from people all across the country, especially people in the oil patch, obviously very worried about what this means for the oil sands. We're hearing from Indigenous leaders in British Columbia who are overjoyed with this. You know, if it's a nightmare for the Liberal government, it's a dream come true for Indigenous leaders in BC who've been fighting against this project for years. We also heard earlier today from Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Take a look.
I believe that the Trudeau cabinet should revisit this, try to get out of the $4.5 billion purchase of a 65-year-old leaky pipeline, and call it quits on a project that should never go ahead.
So Finance Minister Bill Morneau saying that they will review the decision today, but they are not going to call it quits, at least not at this point, Andrew.
All right, JP, thank you. The CBC's JP Tasker in Ottawa. We are also hearing from Kinder Morgan Canada on the court ruling. It says, we are reviewing the decision with the Government of Canada and are taking the appropriate time to assess next steps. They go on to say, we remain committed to building this project in consideration of communities and the environment with meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples and for the benefit of Canadians. Trans Mountain is currently taking measures to suspend construction. The ruling from the Federal Court of Appeal is welcome news for some in British Columbia. Many First Nations communities, environmentalists, and politicians have been lobbying against the pipeline expansion. And the CBC's Renee Filipponi has their reaction today.
To say the mood, I would call it ecstatic. People are elated. They're saying this is momentous. From the Indigenous community specifically, we heard from members of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh First Nation who are behind this appeal this morning. And what they're basically saying is this supports what they've been saying all along, that there was never enough consultation specifically for their nations when it came to the impact that tanker traffic could have on their communities and their survival. And this basically just shows that the Trudeau government in their mind isn't really putting enough emphasis on reconciliation if they're not doing the work that they need to do when it comes to consultation with First Nations. Now, a lot of emotional words from the community members there reacting to this because they were very surprised. You know, that one leader said this has sort of restored his faith in the judicial system and that this really is, from their perspective, a fight for their generation. Have a listen, for the future generations. Have a listen to what they had to say at the press conference.
It's a proud moment for us as Indigenous people across the country, across the land. Little nations came together and created victory. And this is a victory for all of us.
So basically what the court has ordered is that they would have to redo phase 3 consultation, and according to the leaders who are part of this battle, this basically means going back to square one, and it will be a hard-fought process going forward for the federal government when it comes to making sure they do all the consultation that they feel is needed.
The CBC's Renee Filipponi in Vancouver.